I thought it would be the perfect getaway, a weekend retreat in a remote cabin in North Dakota. Just me, the woods, and some quiet, peaceful, isolated, exactly what I needed. A break from the noise, the stress, the constant buzz of everyday life. The kind of place where I could finally clear my head and reconnect with myself. No distractions, no people, just nature, just silence. It seemed like the perfect escape, but I should have known better than to think it would be that simple. The cabin was exactly what I expected, small, weathered, tucked away in the middle of nowhere. I had no idea who had built it or why it was even there, but that didn't matter to me. The description online was simple, secluded, peaceful, a place to unwind. No promises of luxury, just a tiny cabin for rent. Nothing special, nothing extravagant, but it seemed perfect. I clicked book without a second thought. I should have looked closer at the fine print. The moment I arrived, something didn't feel right. It wasn't the cabin, not exactly. No, it was the feeling that came with it. A weight, like the air itself, was heavier here, pressing against my chest. At first, I told myself it was just the isolation. After all, this wasn't a vacation spot. It was a tiny cabin far off the beaten path. But there was something else, something I couldn't explain, nagging at the back of my mind. It was only when I stepped inside that I saw the first of the rules. The ones I should have read more carefully. I should have known, but I didn't. The rules were simple at first glance, unassuming, written on a piece of yellowed paper, tucked on the wooden table by the door. The kind of rules you'd expect to see anywhere. Please respect the property, no loud music, don't damage anything. Nothing out of the ordinary. And yet, there was something about them that stood out. The way they were written, the way they were worded, with a precision that felt off. At first, I shrugged it off. I thought it was just a precautionary thing, like any host would do. But then I read the last line, and that's when I started to wonder, what kind of place had I really come to? The rules weren't just guidelines for staying at the cabin. No, they were warnings. Warnings that made me question everything. Do not leave the cabin after dark. Okay, that was strange, but maybe there were wild animals in the area. Then, do not speak to anyone who may come knocking. That one stuck with me. Why would anyone be knocking at a cabin in the middle of nowhere? There was no one else for miles. But it was the last one that truly unsettled me. Do not go into the woods. Just don't. No explanation, no reason, just don't. It was simple, but I couldn't shake the feeling that those rules weren't just suggestions. They were orders. At first, I told myself I was being paranoid. It's just an old cabin, right? Maybe the owner was just eccentric, or maybe these were some kind of tradition they followed. Who knew? I figured I'd spend my weekend there, enjoy the quiet, and forget about the rules. But something felt off about it. Something in the air. Something in the way the trees swayed like they were watching me, waiting. It wasn't just the rules. It was the way the whole place seemed trapped in time. The furniture was old, the walls creaked with the wind, but it wasn't just that. There was a feeling that the house itself had a history that I didn't know, that I wasn't meant to know. I tried to shake it off, I really did. I thought about going out for a walk, maybe checking out the woods, just to stretch my legs. But then I looked back at those rules. Do not go into the woods. That one kept ringing in my head, like a clock ticking in the background. I figured it was best to stay inside, just in case. So I stayed. I stayed in that cabin, surrounded by nothing but the sound of the wind and the occasional creak of the house settling. But the longer I stayed, the more I started to feel like I was being watched. Not by anything human. Something else. Something that I couldn't see, but I knew was there. I ignored it at first. I thought I was just being jumpy. After all, it was supposed to be peaceful, right? But peace wasn't what I found. It wasn't long before the noises started. Small sounds, subtle at first. A scratch against the window. A soft tap at the door. At first, I told myself it was just the wind, or maybe a critter outside. But then I realized the sounds were too deliberate, too consistent, and there was something else. The air, well, it felt colder as the night went on. a chill that crept into my bones. I pulled the blanket tighter around me, but nothing helped. The shadows outside the cabin, they didn't seem right. They moved too quickly, too deliberately. That's when I saw it. A figure, standing just outside the window. It was barely visible, just a silhouette in the dark. But I knew it was watching me. I froze. My heart raced, pounding in my chest. I wanted to call out, but something in my gut told me not to. Something told me that if I made a sound, if I did anything, it wouldn't end well. So I stayed silent. I stayed still. I watched as the figure moved slowly just beyond the window. It wasn't a person. It wasn't even human. It was something else. I told myself I was imagining it. It had to be the isolation, the silence making me see things that weren't there. But then I heard the knocking, soft at first, then louder. 3 taps, followed by another 3, a rhythm, a pattern, and then silence. I didn't answer. I didn't even move. But inside my mind was screaming. I tried to remind myself of the rules. Don't speak to anyone who knocks. I didn't need to know why. I just needed to follow them. But the knocking didn't stop. It continued throughout the night, every few hours, until I finally couldn't take it anymore. I had to know who, what was out there. I opened the door. I shouldn't have, I know that now. But I did. I stepped outside and the world around me felt wrong. The air was heavier now, like it was pressing against me, trying to hold me in place. I looked into the woods where the shadows seemed to stretch further than they should have, and for a split second, I thought I saw something moving between the trees, but it wasn't the figure I'd seen earlier. This was different, taller, more unnatural. I never should have come. I never should have ignored those rules, because what was out there, what was waiting in the woods, it wasn't just the cabin. It was the place itself, and once you step inside, you can't leave, at least not the same. I'm someone who loves solitude, especially in nature. You know, that kind of solitude where you can hear nothing but the wind, the crunch of dry leaves underfoot, or the soft rustling of branches. That kind of quiet is rare in the world today. I don't need much, just a good book, maybe a notebook to jot down my thoughts, and a place to get away from everything. And when I saw this small cabin listed for rent in North Dakota, it seemed like the perfect chance to unwind. I've been to remote places before, so I thought nothing of it. It was a simple listing, secluded cabin for rent, peace and quiet guaranteed. I figured, why not? A weekend away from the city, from work, from all the noise. It sounded perfect. I guess you could say I was running away, not from anyone or anything specific, just from the constant pressure of life, the daily grind, the never-ending noise of people talking, phones ringing, the endless stream of emails, the demands of others. I needed a break, something simple, no distractions, just me and the trees, maybe a nice walk in the forest, clear my head, find some peace. I thought I could write, maybe finally finish a project that had been sitting on my desk for months. And the location, North Dakota, well, that was a plus. Quiet, sparse. It seemed like the kind of place where nothing would interrupt me. I just wanted to breathe again. I spent the drive there thinking about how nice it would be to just disappear for a while. I had my music turned off for most of the trip, letting the hum of the engine and the occasional bird call be my only companions. It was a long drive, sure, but I didn't mind. There's something about being on the road, the emptiness, that lets your mind wander. I thought about old friends, family, the kind of life I wanted to lead. For the first time in a while, I felt a sense of calm, but that was before I saw it, the cabin. It wasn't anything special at first glance, nothing out of the ordinary. A small rustic cabin. It had a weathered charm to it, the kind you see in old photos, in stories where people go off the grid and find themselves. I had seen the pictures online. The wooden exterior, the wraparound porch, the small stone chimney. It was exactly what I had been imagining when I booked it. There was nothing inherently wrong with it. But as I drove closer, a strange feeling settled in my gut. The air felt thick, the sky seemed a little too gray, and I could have sworn the wind was carrying something that didn't quite belong. Maybe it was just my imagination, or maybe it was just the isolation of the place setting in. But in that moment, this weight, this heaviness that seemed to hang over the entire area. I had been expecting silence, the kind of silence you only find when there's no one around for miles. But when I arrived, there was an emptiness that felt different. It wasn't peaceful, not in the way I had imagined. It was more like it was too still, as if the world itself was holding its breath. I parked my car by the cabin, taking in the surroundings. Wide, open fields stretching out into the distance, bordered by dense woods that seemed to go on forever. No other buildings in sight. No signs of life. No animals. It should have felt freeing, right? But instead, it felt like the world had shut me out. Like the trees, the wind, the earth, they were all just watching me. I tried to shake it off. Maybe I was just tired. I'd been on the road for hours after all. It's easy to let your mind wander, to get paranoid in such an isolated place. I grabbed my bag from the trunk, locked the car, and walked up the steps to the porch. The wood creaked beneath my feet, not the kind of creak you'd expect from an old house. No, this was different, hollow, like something was under the floorboards. But I didn't think much of it then. I just wanted to settle in. I took out the keys, opened the door, and stepped inside. The inside was exactly what I'd hoped for. Simple, rustic. A small kitchen area with an old-fashioned stove, a wooden table in the center of the room, a worn couch, and a small fireplace. There were a few pieces of artwork on the walls, mostly landscapes, and an old rocking chair by the window. It looked like the kind of place someone had lovingly maintained, despite the passage of time. It smelled faintly of dust and pine wood. But even though everything looked in place, there was something strange about the atmosphere, something off. The silence wasn't just quiet, it was unnatural, like there was an absence of sound that shouldn't have been there. I noticed it immediately. The air felt heavy. I could almost taste it, this damp, cold weight that hung around, as though the house itself was holding on to something, a secret. The walls felt thicker, like they were enclosing around me, and the shadows in the corners seemed deeper, darker than they should have been. The windows, though they let in light, gave the oddest reflections. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but it felt like the outside world had been shut out, and not in a peaceful, tranquil way. No, this was different. This was the kind of quiet that makes you question if you're really alone. I tried to ignore it, of course. I told myself I was just imagining things. After all, I'd come here to escape the noise, right? To find some peace. So I unpacked my things, set up my bed in the small room at the back of the cabin, and made myself at home. It was when I started unpacking my things that I noticed something else. A small, handwritten note on the table. It was folded neatly, sitting under a dusty old lamp that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. The note was simple, just 3 sentences, 3 rules scrawled in a hurried, unsteady hand. Do not leave the property after dark. Do not speak to anyone who may come knocking. Do not go into the woods. At first, I thought it was just some quirky thing, some kind of odd rule set by the owner to keep things in order. I figured it was just a precautionary thing. But as I read those words again, something about them didn't sit right. Why tell me not to leave after dark? And why the woods? I'd seen the woods on the drive-in, and they looked like nothing more than a dense, untouched forest. What could possibly be so dangerous about them? But as I stood there, staring at those words, something started to gnaw at me. It was the tone. The way they were written, with a kind of urgency that didn't belong in a simple note. I couldn't shake the feeling that those rules weren't meant to be ignored. They weren't just suggestions. They were warnings. Warnings about something I didn't understand, something I wasn't supposed to question. I wanted to laugh it off. I wanted to dismiss it as nothing more than the overprotectiveness of a paranoid cabin owner. But when I looked around the room, I realized something I hadn't noticed before. It was too quiet, the kind of silence that felt suffocating. The windows, though open, didn't let in any air. It was still, too still. The weight in the air was getting heavier, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck begin to rise. Something was wrong. I could feel it in my bones. Something was wrong with the cabin, with the rules, with everything. I should have left. I should have listened to that feeling, that nagging suspicion. But instead, I told myself it was just nerves, just the isolation. After all, I was here for peace, for quiet. I didn't need to worry about some strange note, right? I was alone. The only thing I had to worry about was myself. But as the night started to fall, as the light outside began to fade, I knew, deep down, that something was about to change. Something was going to happen. When I first saw the cabin, it looked perfect, exactly what I had imagined. Maybe even a little too perfect. It was an old structure, wooden, with a stone chimney that curled up into the overcast sky. A bit weathered, but well kept, like something you'd expect to find in an old photograph of a quiet countryside retreat. It was tucked at the edge of a dense forest, isolated from any signs of civilization. Nothing around for miles. The kind of place where you could disappear for days, or longer, if you wanted to. I remember thinking, as I stood there with the keys in my hand, that this place had the potential to be everything I was looking for. A sanctuary, a place where the world didn't exist, a place where time slowed down. But as I walked up to the cabin, something started to feel off. I couldn't place it. At first, I thought it was the sheer isolation of the place. There were no neighbors, no sounds of traffic, or even birds in the trees. The wind was still. The air felt unnaturally thick, as though it wasn't meant to be disturbed. I stepped onto the porch, and the wooden boards creaked beneath my feet. Not the usual creak of age you might expect, but a hollow sound. A sound that seemed to echo longer than it should have. I glanced at the trees surrounding the cabin. Tall, dark pines that stretched toward the sky like they were trying to block out the sun. It was as if the forest had been waiting here for something. Watching. I stood there for a moment longer than I should have, just taking in the view. The sky was a dull, grayish hue, like a storm was just waiting to happen. But there was no thunder, no rain. It was just heavy. It felt like the air itself was waiting, as if the world was holding its breath. I turned the handle of the front door, the old wood groaning in protest as I pushed it open. A rush of cool, pine-scented air hit me. It smelled fresh, but there was something sharp underneath it, something burnt, like old embers that never quite died. The inside of the cabin was cozy, too cozy, in fact, the kind of cozy that made you feel like you were stepping back in time, the kind of place where nothing had changed for decades. The walls were lined with old, worn bookshelves, their spines faded and dust-covered. There was a fireplace in the corner, the stonework darkened with age. The furniture was simple, nothing fancy, just a small wooden table, an armchair by the window, and a dusty couch that looked like it hadn't been sat in for years. The kind of place where you could imagine someone retreating to alone, far from the world. It wasn't particularly clean, but it wasn't exactly filthy either. There was an air of neglect about it, like the cabin had been forgotten, left to age on its own, untouched by time. But there was something strange about the silence inside. It was thick, almost oppressive, like the place hadn't been lived in for years. I could hear the faintest rustling from the woods outside, but even that seemed muffled, as though the trees themselves were holding back their sounds. Inside, everything felt still. Too still. The dust in the corners of the room looked like it had settled centuries ago, untouched by the wind or the hand of time. And the furniture, especially the rocking chair by the window, seemed almost too perfect. It was positioned in such a way that it invited you to sit, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something had sat there far too many times before me. The strangest thing, though, was the air. It smelled of pine and dust, sure, but there was that lingering sharpness, like something had burned recently. Or maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But the scent wasn't quite right. It was faint, but present. It wasn't the kind of smell that should have lingered in a cabin that looked this old and unused. I walked around the room, my feet making soft, echoing sounds on the wooden floors, my eyes drifting over old photographs on the walls, some of which had been taken decades ago. I couldn't make out all the faces in the photographs, but one in particular caught my eye. An old black and white picture of a woman standing in front of the cabin, smiling. She looked content, but there was something in her eyes, something that seemed too knowing, too aware. I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched. I turned away from the photograph quickly, my eyes scanning the room, and that's when I noticed it. The note. It was on the table by the door, sitting there as though it had always been meant to be there. It was a small, folded piece of yellowed paper, its edges frayed from age. I almost didn't see it at first. The cabin had a certain cluttered charm, but nothing that would draw my attention to something as mundane as a note. Still, I picked it up. It was handwritten, uneven, hurried script, like the person had been in a rush to write it down. The note wasn't long. It was short, simple, and at first glance it seemed like something you'd find in any rental cabin, just a few house rules. But as I read them, something shifted in my gut. The rules were strange. They weren't your average stay-at-the-cabin kind of instructions. No, these rules felt more like commands, orders. Do not leave the property after sunset. Okay, that was odd, but I figured maybe the owner didn't want guests wandering off at night, given how remote it was. Then, do not speak to anyone who may come knocking. That one sent a chill down my spine. Why would anyone be knocking at a cabin in the middle of nowhere? I hadn't seen a single car or person on the road since I left the highway. But it was the last rule that really caught my attention, the one that didn't make any sense. Do not go into the woods. That one hit me hard. The woods were just right there, stretching out in every direction. I could see them from the window. There was nothing dangerous about them. No cliffs, no mountains, just dense trees and thick underbrush. Why would they tell me not to go into the woods? The more I thought about it, the more I realized how peculiar it all seemed. The rules weren't just strange. They were unsettling. They felt like a warning. I tried to laugh it off. I convinced myself that the owner was just some eccentric person, maybe with a flair for the dramatic. But when I looked at the rules again, something in the back of my mind told me I couldn't ignore them. I'd already broken the first rule, hadn't I? I had arrived before sunset. What would happen if I broke the other rules? I couldn't help but think about the feeling I had gotten when I first stepped inside. That weight in the air, the sensation that something wasn't quite right. I had hoped it was just nerves, but now, reading these rules, that feeling only deepened. It wasn't just a coincidence. It wasn't just the cabin's age. Something was wrong here, and it wasn't going to let me leave. I thought about the woods, about how still and silent everything had been when I arrived. But the woods, the more I thought about them, the more they seemed to draw me in. It was like they were calling me, even though I knew I shouldn't go. And yet, the rule was clear. I wasn't supposed to go into the woods. But what would happen if I did? I couldn't shake the thought. I couldn't stop thinking about it. I didn't know what the consequences were, but I felt them, like something was waiting out there, just beyond the tree line, watching me, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Nightfall came quickly. 1 minute, the dim gray light from the sky was gently fading into twilight, and the next, the cabin was engulfed in an eerie darkness, broken only by the weak flicker of a single lantern on the table. I lit the lantern, thinking I could make the place feel a little more inviting, but the shadows, they didn't quite retreat the way I thought they would. They just lingered, stretched across the walls, across the floor, swallowing up the corners. I tried to ignore it. After all, it was just a cabin in the woods, right? Just an old place where the night's darkness feels a little thicker than usual. It wasn't long before I started hearing things. At first, it was soft, almost like a brush of wind against the walls, a faint rustling at the edges of the house. I figured it was just the wind shifting in the trees outside, the way the branches creaked in the cold, but then it became more distinct, a slow, deliberate sound, footsteps, thump, thump, thump. At first, I thought maybe it was an animal, some deer or raccoon walking by the porch. I'd heard stories about how wildlife in these parts sometimes wandered close to human settlements. But this was different. It wasn't the random shuffle of paws or the brush of a branch. No, these steps were too methodical, too intentional, almost as if someone was walking around the cabin, someone who knew exactly where they were stepping. I froze. My heart thudded in my chest, and I felt that same oppressive weight from earlier, the one I couldn't shake. I wasn't alone. Not anymore. I stood still, straining my ears to listen, hoping it was just a trick of the wind, maybe the house settling. But the footsteps kept coming. They circled the cabin, slow and measured, like whoever it was looking for something or someone. I moved to the window, careful not to make a sound, hoping I might catch a glimpse of whatever it was outside. I leaned close to the glass, my breath fogging up the window as I tried to peer through the shadows. I couldn't see anything at first. Nothing moved, no figure, no shape in the dark, but the sound a tap on the glass. Light but clear, deliberate, tap, tap, tap. I jumped back, my heart nearly leaping out of my chest. I looked around the room, searching for an explanation. Maybe a branch had brushed against the window. Maybe something else had caused the noise. But no. The window was clean, the night still, no wind, no branches. I stood there, frozen, waiting for the next sound, for the next movement. Then came another tap, but this time it was louder, closer, and I swear I heard something else along with it, a faint whisper, too soft to make out but unmistakable, like someone was speaking just outside but too far for me to understand. I couldn't take it anymore. I ran to the window again, pulling the curtain aside quickly to look outside. Nothing. No one. Just the yard, empty. The woods stood like a dark wall at the edge of the yard, the trees swaying slightly in the breeze, but no sign of movement. I felt a rush of relief flood over me, a false sense of calm, but something in the back of my mind told me it was too easy. It was too quiet, too perfect. I stood there, watching the yard for a long while, waiting for something to happen. And that's when I saw it. At the very edge of the trees, just past the shadowed line where the yard met the woods, something moved. I didn't know what it was at first. The darkness between the trees was thick, but I could make out a shape. Just beyond the tree line, something shifted. It was quick, a flicker of movement so fast that I almost didn't see it. But then there it was again. A figure tall and thin, barely visible in the blackness. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. This was something else. Someone else. I blinked and rubbed my eyes, convinced I was seeing things, but when I looked back, the figure was still there. But this time, it was closer. The shadows were deeper, but the outline of a person was unmistakable, standing just inside the trees, staring at the cabin. I didn't move. I couldn't move. My eyes were locked on that figure, and yet I couldn't make out any details. It wasn't just the darkness, it was something else. Something that made my skin crawl. The figure didn't move, it just stood there still, like it was waiting for something, waiting for me to do something. I reached for the door, my hand trembling as I fumbled for the lock. I didn't know what I was planning to do. Run out, confront whoever or whatever that was, maybe. But before I could even touch the handle, the figure moved, and it was gone. Just like that. 1 second it was there, and the next, nothing. No trace, no sound, no movement. I backed away from the window. My head was spinning. Was it a person? Was it a shadow? Was I just imagining things? But it wasn't just that figure. It was everything. The air in the cabin felt heavier now, thicker. The silence outside felt even more oppressive. I tried to tell myself that it was nothing, that it was just my mind playing tricks on me in the isolation. But then I heard it again, the tapping. A single tap, softer this time, coming from the same window where I'd seen the figure. And then again, tap, tap. It was more insistent now, not a random knock, not an animal. Someone or something was tapping on the window, trying to get in. I ran to the window again, my heart racing. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to know what was out there. I had to see it. My breath fogged the glass as I pulled back the curtain once more. And that's when I saw him. A man. standing at the edge of the tree line, like before. But this time he was closer, much closer, and in his hands he held something gleaming in the moonlight. I couldn't make it out at first, but as he lifted it, I saw it clearly. A knife, long, sharp, and gleaming under the light of the lantern I had left inside. The man didn't move. He didn't blink. He just stood there, staring at me. And the worst part, I don't think he was looking at the cabin. He was looking directly at me. I stepped back from the window, my legs shaking, my mind scrambling for some explanation, anything that could explain what I was seeing. I tried the phone, tried calling the owner. No signal, nothing. The lines were dead. I kept hearing that scratching sound again, like something or someone was trying to get in. I couldn't understand it. Why wasn't anyone answering? Why was this happening? What was I supposed to do? The rules kept running through my mind. The warnings. I checked the window once more, my hands trembling as I peered through the glass. And I swear I saw him again, just standing there, but this time he was so close that if I'd opened the window I could have touched him. But when I blinked, he was gone, vanished into the trees, just like the first time. What do I do now? What does it all mean? Who is he? What does he want? And why the rules? Why was I told not to go into the woods? I need to leave. I need to get out of here, but something tells me I'm not going to make it out. I should have stayed inside. I should have followed the rules, but I couldn't help myself. Curiosity had dug its claws into me. It's strange how a place can feel so alive with tension that it practically beckons you to defy it, to step into the unknown, despite every instinct screaming at you to turn back. I had been told not to go into the woods. The note was clear, do not go into the woods. And yet, something in me cracked. It was that damn feeling, that constant, gnawing sensation that I wasn't alone, that I was being watched, that something in the shadows of the trees was waiting for me to break, to make a move. I knew I was being irrational. I knew I shouldn't do it, but I grabbed the flashlight anyway. The beam of light flickered in my trembling hands as I stepped out of the cabin, the door creaking shut behind me like a warning I refused to heed. I told myself it was just the wind, or my mind playing tricks. But as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, the sound of footsteps in the distance, my own, someone else's, I couldn't tell, but it was there, always there, close, but never close enough for me to catch a glimpse. The trees towered over me, like silent sentinels watching my every move. The deeper I ventured, the more oppressive the air became, thick with something I couldn't name, something unnatural. The wind howled louder, whipping through the branches, and every so often I thought I heard a faint whisper, like distant voices caught on the breeze. I'd stop, listen, and hear nothing, but the unease never left. The darkness in the woods seemed to close in on me with every step I took. The flashlight flickered again, casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to shift just out of the corner of my eye. The further I went, the more distorted the trees seemed, bent at odd angles, twisted, almost as if they were reaching for me. For a moment I thought about turning back, but it was too late for that. My legs were already moving deeper into the forest. Then I found it, a clearing. It was small, but the air felt different here, heavier. I stopped dead in my tracks, my flashlight beam trembling as it swept across the clearing. And that's when I saw it, the circle of stones, blackened with soot. The edges of each stone were jagged, rough, and scorched like they had been subjected to an unnatural heat. They formed a perfect circle, as though they had been placed there intentionally. In the center of the circle stood a wooden idol. It wasn't tall, maybe 4 feet, but it had an aura that made my skin crawl. It was carved from dark wood, twisted faces etched into the surface. Faces contorted in agony, mouths open in silent screams. Eyes hollow, staring back at me with something in them I couldn't quite name. Something almost alive. I stood there, staring at the idol, and the whispering started. Faint at first, like the rustling of leaves, but then it grew louder. Distant voices, chanting in a language I didn't understand. The air in the clearing felt thicker now, the temperature dropping suddenly, as if the very earth beneath me was growing colder with each second. The whispering didn't make any sense, but it felt wrong, like the very ground I stood on was soaked in history, a history I was never meant to uncover. I couldn't look away from the idol, from the faces that seemed to watch me, each twisted expression telling a story that I didn't want to hear. I took a step forward, my feet unsteady on the uneven ground, and that's when I heard it. A crack, loud enough to echo through the woods, the sound of a branch snapping, followed by the unmistakable crunch of leaves underfoot. I spun around, my heart in my throat. For a moment I thought it was just the wind, something else moving in the forest. But no. There, just outside the clearing, standing perfectly still in the shadows of the trees, was a figure. It was hard to make out at first, but then I saw it clearly, too clearly. The figure was tall, much taller than a person should be, and it stood perfectly still, not moving an inch. I couldn't see a face. It was just darkness. The blackness of the woods seemed to absorb it, like it was part of the night itself. No eyes, no expression, no details, just a shape, standing and watching me. I froze. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. It felt like the figure was pulling all the air from the clearing, suffocating me. My chest tightened, and I knew I had to leave, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. I just stood there, staring at the figure, and I couldn't look away. Then the whispering grew louder, closer. It wasn't just in the air anymore. It was coming from the trees, from the ground, from the very earth beneath me. The voices, hundreds of them, were chanting, pleading, calling to me, but not with words. No, these weren't words. They were something deeper, a sensation, a feeling of loss, of regret, of fear so primal that it cut through me like a blade, and all I could do was stand there and listen to it. I turned back to the idol, as if it held the answers. I don't know why. I think it was some sort of desperate need to make sense of what was happening. But when I looked at it again, I saw something new. The faces, those twisted faces carved into the wood, weren't just distorted. They were moving. Slowly. I couldn't tell if it was my mind playing tricks on me, but the faces, they were shifting. The mouths were opening wider, the eyes turning to follow my every movement. And then I realized with a sickening jolt that I wasn't alone in the clearing. The figure behind me, it was closer. I could feel its presence right behind me. I could feel its breath on the back of my neck. My entire body screamed to run, to get away, but I was frozen in place. I didn't dare turn around. I couldn't. Not because I didn't want to face whatever was there, but because I knew that if I did, I would never get the chance to run. And then I heard it. A voice, a low, guttural whisper, too close now. It wasn't in the air. It wasn't from the trees or the wind. No, it was in my ear. Right there, just behind me. The voice wasn't speaking to me, but it was saying my name. Slowly, deliberately. It wasn't my voice. It wasn't any voice I recognized. And the worst part, it wasn't human. I didn't wait to hear more. I turned. I ran. I don't know how far I ran, how long I ran, but I didn't stop. I didn't dare look back. I could hear the footsteps behind me, keeping pace, never slowing. And when I finally reached the edge of the woods, when I thought I was safe, when I thought the clearing was behind me, I turned around. The woods were empty. The clearing was gone. It was as if it had never been there at all. The trees stood silently, unchanged, just the way they had been when I first entered. I looked back toward the cabin, my heart racing, but all I could see was the faint glow of the lantern in the distance. I didn't know if what I had seen had been real, or if I had imagined it all in a moment of panic, but deep down I knew. I knew it wasn't over, and I knew I had made a terrible mistake. I didn't know what to do. My mind was racing, heart hammering in my chest, but my legs, they wouldn't cooperate. They moved, but not with the certainty of someone who knew where they were going. I was running blind, lost in the woods, trapped by something that had no shape, no form, only a presence. A suffocating force that seemed to draw me further in, pulling me deeper, further from the safety I thought I knew. The trees, they were everywhere, closing in on me. No matter how fast I ran, how many turns I took, there was no escape. The woods were shifting, changing. warping like I was stuck in a nightmare that wouldn't let me wake up. I thought I could see the clearing up ahead. I thought I could see the light of the cabin, that faint glow, my cabin, the one I had fled from so quickly. But as I ran toward it, the trees seemed to bend, stretching their limbs like they were trying to stop me. The path twisted, warped. I tried to backtrack, but it was no use. The trees were all the same, and the world had become a blur of endless darkness. There were no landmarks, no way to tell where I was. I tried to shout, to scream for help, but my voice seemed to get lost in the woods, swallowed by the thick silence that smothered the air around me. I ran for what felt like hours. My legs burned. My chest ached with each breath, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't let whatever was following me catch up. But the more I ran, the more I began to realize that I wasn't going anywhere. No matter how far I ran, the woods stretched out forever. The trees were the same, their branches twisted into grotesque shapes, their shadows consuming the light of the flashlight. It felt as though the forest itself was a prison, closing in on me, suffocating me. The woods were the trap. There was no escape. I didn't know when it happened, but at some point the panic started to fade, replaced by something else, something colder. A creeping numbness settled in my bones. I couldn't tell if it was the cold or something deeper, but my body felt distant, as if I were already a ghost moving through this place. That's when I noticed it, the cabin. The faint light I had seen in the distance, it was there again. But something was wrong. The angle was off. The shadows around it stretched too far. The trees, they had grown closer, almost as if they were pressing in around it. The cabin looked different, almost wrong. I stumbled toward it, my legs unsteady, unsure whether I was walking in a dream or in some twisted reality. But as I approached, I couldn't help but feel that the house I had left behind wasn't the same. It looked older now, dilapidated in a way I hadn't noticed before. The paint on the walls had begun to peel, the windows shattered as if something had broken through from the inside. The door that had been once left ajar, welcoming, was now shut tight. It wasn't just the cabin itself that had changed, though. It was the air. The silence around it was suffocating, and the strange feeling of being watched never left. It was like the cabin itself had become a part of the forest, a twisted piece of it. I ran inside, desperate for safety, but nothing inside felt right. The air inside was thick, heavy with a stale, burnt smell that made me gag. The furniture was the same, but the dust, it was thicker. The old books lined the shelves, but the faces in the photographs, those same faces I had seen earlier, had changed. They weren't the same people. They were different. The faces looked older, twisted in expression, and the eyes, they followed me. I swear they did. The walls seemed to breathe, like the cabin itself was alive, watching me, waiting for me. I thought about the rules that had been so clear when I first arrived. Do not leave the property after sunset. Do not speak to anyone who may come knocking. Do not go into the woods. I had broken them all. I had broken them, and I was paying the price. But this wasn't just about the rules anymore. It was something bigger, something older, something that had been here long before I ever stepped foot on this land. I could feel it now, the weight of whatever was watching, waiting in the shadows. I didn't know what it wanted, but I knew it wasn't done with me. I tried to leave again. I needed to leave, but the door wouldn't open. It was locked from the inside. I slammed my fists against it, my desperation growing with each strike. I tried the windows, nothing. I was trapped again in that same twisted playset with no way out. It was like the world had folded in on itself. I don't know how much time passed, minutes, hours, days. But as the night stretched on, I realized with growing horror that I wasn't alone. Something was in the cabin with me, though I couldn't see it. I could feel it moving, hear the faint scuttling noises, the soft rustle of fabric brushing against the wood. The rules weren't just warnings. They were warnings for a reason. I don't know what happened after that. I don't remember how I finally left the cabin, or how I ended up back on the road. The next thing I knew, I was driving away, my eyes wide, my mind fractured, but still hearing the whispers in my ears, still feeling the eyes on me. By the time I reached the nearest town, I was already different. I wasn't the same person who had walked into that cabin. The world looked different. It felt different. Nothing was as it had been before. Some say the cabin is still there, waiting for the next person to break the rules, to wander too far, to dare enter the woods. But I can't be sure. All I know is that when I left, when I finally drove away, I wasn't the same person. Something inside me had changed, and I could never get it back. So if you ever hear about that cabin, and you find yourself wondering if you should visit, if you should ignore the rules, remember one thing. Some places don't just trap you. They change you. And once you're gone, you're never truly free. Not from them. Not from what's still watching. Not from what followed me. I can still feel it sometimes. The eyes, the whispers, as if something is waiting for me to return. I don't think I ever really left that cabin. And I don't think I ever will. Have you ever stayed in a place that just felt wrong? You know, the kind of place where every corner seems to hold its breath, where the silence feels like a weight pressing down on you? Maybe it's the strange rules, or the air that hangs heavy with something you can't quite put your finger on, but you know something isn't right. That's how I felt the moment I walked into that cabin, and honestly, I don't think I'll ever be able to explain it completely. The rules, they weren't just rules. They were warnings, signs of something far darker at play. Something I should have seen coming, but didn't. I wonder now what they really meant. What were those strange rules for? Why were they so strict? And why does it feel like they were meant to keep something in or keep us out? Maybe you've had a similar experience. Maybe you've stayed in a place that seemed perfectly fine on the surface, but something, just one tiny thing, made your skin crawl. That odd smell, that cold draft, the feeling that someone or something was watching you when you thought you were alone. I know now that we're not always alone. There are places where the rules aren't just meant to protect you. They're meant to make sure you never leave. But what about you? Would you have ignored the warnings? Would you have dared to stay in that cabin, knowing what you know now? Or would you have run the second you saw those strange, unsettling rules? I'll admit, I'm not sure I'd have stayed if I had known what I know now. But that's the thing about fear. It's always easier to recognize in hindsight. So, I want to hear from you. Have you ever stayed somewhere that felt like it was hiding something? A place that made you question every decision you made the moment you crossed the threshold? Maybe it was a cabin in the woods, an old hotel, or an abandoned house. I want to know your stories. What happened to you? Do you think the rules were there to protect you or to trap you? Let me know in the comments below. I'm not the only one who's been haunted by this feeling, and I'm curious to know if anyone else has had a similar experience. If you were in my shoes, would you have stayed or left? And if you've experienced something even worse, well, maybe it's time you shared it. Who knows? You might just help someone else avoid a mistake I made. If you've enjoyed this story and you want more tales from the darkest corners of the world, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. I'm always digging for the most terrifying stories out there, and if you're brave enough, I'll bring them straight to you. Just be careful though. Sometimes the scariest stories aren't the ones you hear, but the ones you live. Until next time, keep your eyes open. You never know when the next chapter of your own horror story might begin.